America supports Israel unconditionally in the diplomatic, strategic, military, financial spheres. There is a whole line of thought in America from academic Stephen Walt of Harvard University and John Mearsheimer of Chicago University that says that Zionist influence through AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Commission, is so strong that it has succeeded in making American foreign policy prioritize the national interest of Israel over the national interest of the United States. Now, the United States is not so much bent on war, public opinion, against Iran, but Israel is. So one can envision that Israel is a wild card. It might unilaterally attack Iran. It will then bear a counterattack, which will be ferocious from Iran against Israel. And then the Western media will plan the whole thing out so that it will drag public opinion from America and Europe to support Israel. And what can happen after that is anybody's guess, because we don't know what Russia will do. We don't know what China will do. We don't even know what Pakistan and India will do.
Now,
and they are nuclear powers.
So you bring in the more regional and even a global perspective here. But we saw the American-backed NATO effort in Libya. Just over the past week or so, we've been seeing the reports from a UN nuclear watchdog about Syria and an alleged nuclear plant there that actually for the past 2 decades has been a cotton mill. Now the UN nuclear watchdog talking about a possible strike on Iran. Just what is the geopolitical global agenda here coming from the West?
Well, I think that basically we have a global power elite that is embedded in the United States, embedded in the United Kingdom, and in many countries of Europe, but is not part of the United States, Britain, and the European Union. They are bent on world government, and they use the U.S. military prowess to try to achieve that, and NATO's prowess to try to achieve that. Now, what we have seen in Libya is very different from what can happen with Iran, because Gaddafi committed the same mistake that Saddam Hussein is, and that's being alone in the crossfire. But Iran is not Iraq, Iran is not Libya, and things will be very different. And I even believe that perhaps in their desperation, they are looking towards a World War III scenario, because as happened with World War II, it is an opportunity to kick the chessboard and reshuffle all the cards. And I suppose that this global power elite bent on world government will try to reshuffle all the cards in their favor.
No such place. The British forces, American forces, NATO forces, they're around us everywhere. They're surrounding Iran. And those same forces say Iran is interfering in the internal affairs of the region. What could we say to that?
Dr. Tang Dan-kun, you're the Director and Research Fellow of the Center for Arms Control, China Institute of International Studies, and it's great to have you with us today.
Yeah, me too.
So Russia and China have found themselves recently in the same camp trying to prevent a possible military intervention into Syria. Do you think it's a short-lived partnership, or maybe a greater strategic vision that could actually consequently affect the distribution of power worldwide?
Since we share the same responsibility, we're facing the same challenges. For example, we learn lessons from the Libya case. Last year, the military intervention by the Western countries did give us lessons. How can we safeguard the peace and stability in regional affairs? So this time, I'm sure the two countries can exchange their ideas toward the regional dispute to prevent any conflict or war.
Well, one occasionally still hears that the Western countries still may invade Syria going around the UN resolution, like it has happened in Iraq, for example. What instruments do China and Russia, except their common standpoint on Syria, what other instruments do they have to actually prevent this from happening?
Yeah, China has been very active in the negotiations, in finding peaceful solution, not only Syria dispute, but also in Iran nuclear issue. China this time actually is a mediator or coordinator. I think China is acceptable to all the parties concerned, to Iran, to Russia, to the United States. To my knowledge, there were several rounds of dialogue, among the parties concerned related to the Iranian nuclear issue, and China changed a little bit its attitude to be more active at this time, because China's position, China's policy toward the regional affairs are more acceptable to all the parties concerned.
Another issue that China and Russia are commonly worried about is, of course, the American anti-missile defense system. We're hearing about the United States plans to actually build an early warning radar in South Japan, and at the same time Russia is increasingly worried about the United States plans to enhance its missile defense capabilities in Europe. Do you think that China and Russia could maybe come up with a joint reaction to this plan, or each country should deal with that on their own?
Yeah, actually, this is a question I asked to your Vice Foreign Minister, whether China and Russia can join together to establish a counting missile defense system. He didn't give me a direct answer. Maybe there are a lot of obstacles on the way for China and Russia to cooperate in this regard. For example, political obstacles and the technical obstacles. I don't think at this moment the two countries' militaries, prefer to share their missile information, the data. Maybe Russia would like to share the information with the United States because you have a START treaty. But I think Russia and China now are facing the same challenge. The missile defense project, started 20 years ago. Actually, in the eyes of your country, of Russian, of Chinese, is really a bad program, which will deteriorate or destroy the strategic stability among big powers.
How far do you think the United States is willing to go in confronting both Russia and China in this issue?
I think it's a strategic step by the United States from the two sides. Russia and China, live on the same continent, Eurasia continent, and from the Europe side, they deployed the missile defense system, in some European countries, and in Asia Pacific region, another side of the Eurasia continent. They deployed the missile defense system in Alaska, deployed the missile defense systems in Japan, South Korea, and even China's Taiwan. So they tried to squeeze the Eurasian continent. Actually, the two big powers, Russia and China, in the eyes of the United States nowadays are major challenges for their security. So this time, the United States just try to contain the two countries. Of course, missile defense is not only a military project. I think it's a political project. It's also a technical project. So this time, I don't think this is a good project for the international relations at this moment.
The economic crisis in Eurozone is another huge topic that has actually really got to everyone around, and it has also undermined Chinese demand in Chinese export. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity for the Chinese to invest. So maybe could this crisis be more an opportunity than a problem?
I think a Chinese attitude toward the European crisis, financial crisis, has been very cautious. There are a lot of seminars and workshops and a lot of ideas whether China should give financial support, economic support to the financial crisis zone, especially the European countries. But I think so far the Chinese government has been very cautious toward these ideas. I can give you another example. Trade with our neighboring countries, with Japan. We are now suffering the island dispute. During the previous year, but the trade between the two countries is still increasing, even today.
On the back of this crisis, when everyone's talking about the possible recession in European economy, you hear people talk more and more about the fact that Russia needs to turn towards the east at this point. So if that was to happen, if Russia were to turn itself towards China, how would that change the very face of the Russian-Chinese relationship if we were to forge that economic tie?
China actually has been the engine of world economy at least for 30 years. So I think your policy toward Asia Pacific region, especially toward China, is a good choice, in economic cooperation in trade. Actually, I think the two countries, though we are neighbors, not so good, in economy, our trade with Japan, with ASEAN nations increased very fast. But I think Sino-Russian economic relations are not as good as the relations, the trade, with Japan, with ASEAN nations. So we have much room to do more cooperation in this regard, in economy and trade.
Moving on now, the war rhetoric from Washington towards Iran is again being ramped up just ahead of the second round of high-level international talks on the country's nuclear program. US military top brass claim they would need just 3 weeks to defeat Iran's armed forces. Our TV's Ganesh Chakan looks at whether it's just more tough talk or preparation for real action.
The Pentagon says they're just doing some contingency planning in case Iran attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz or attacks U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf. But analysts say it's the kind of planning that drives the tensions to a whole new level. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that Iran is encircled militarily. Here is Iran, and here are the countries in red where the U.S. has military presence. We tried to put on the map those U.S. bases which have been reported about. They are in flashing blue here. Here you have the friendly Arab countries. Right next to Qatar, it's Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet. That's 40 ships, 16,000 personnel, 2 huge aircraft carriers. Kuwait, which right after the drawdown in Iraq, the U.S. there has increased the size of standby combat force. America's Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines are boldly positioned in Oman and the United Arab Emirates. That's to the south of Iran, in Turkey and Israel to the west, and Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east. Most recently, the U.S. Air Force has dispatched a number of F-22 Raptor strike fighters to a base in the United Arab Emirates. And here it is, the brand new penetrating strike fighter. The move has caused backlash from Tehran. In addition to the hardware, the U.S. Central Command says there are about 125,000 U.S. troops in close proximity to Iran, not to mention new drone bases at undisclosed locations also in the region. U.S. officials say an enhanced presence in the Gulf is meant to serve as a, quote, quick reaction contingency force, not simply as a prelude to war. But the buildup seems to exacerbate the hostile talk, which may at one point turn into an all-out confrontation. The Iranian military is, of course, no match to the American military might. After all, we're talking about the country that spends on its military more than the next 10 top defense spending countries combined. So crushing Iran is in America's power, but most analysts agree. What's also in its power is producing the kind of instability in the region that would be far worse than what came out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
The European Union has imposed tough new sanctions on Iran in a fresh effort to exert pressure over its nuclear program. But Britain, France and Germany have also stressed that they're willing to negotiate if Tehran immediately suspends its atomic activities and respects its international obligations. The EU's Foreign Affairs chief also suggested the door remains open for talks to resolve the situation.
I want to stress, however, that sanctions are not an end in themselves. I've often talked about this being part of a twin-track approach, that the purpose of sanctions is to put pressure on Iran to come back to the negotiating table.
Iran has described the move as psychological warfare and warned it will worsen the standoff over the Islamic State's nuclear program. One minister even threatened the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but American, French and British warships have all passed through